Hello everyone and Assalamu alaikum. This is Introduction to Psychology Part 2 by Dear Knowledge. Okay, so we have started the chapter 2 and it's all about learning. And if I just give you a bit chapter overview, you can see right here, this is a chapter overview and we have already covered the lesson 1, which was about the definition of learning, in which we have learned about the definition of learning with the help of a case study, and we also discussed that is any kind of change learning or not, because there's a big difference between learning and maturation. So in order to remove all those confusion and in order to clear the concept, so we discussed all these points in the lesson 1. If you have missed the lesson 1, I have given a link in the description section. Go ahead, click on that link and watch that video, because it is very important if you are very serious to learn about the chapter of learning. Now, in this video, we will be starting with the lesson 2, which will be about the types of learning. And in types of learning, we will be covering the classical conditioning in this video. So this is going to be the chapter 2, learning, lesson 2, types of learning, part 1, classical conditioning. So it makes your mouth water, the classical conditioning. In the early 1900s, when Freud was just becoming famous in Europe, and the structuralists and the functionalists were arguing over consciousness in the Ivy halls of American universities, research scientists were unhappy with the psychologists' focus on mental activity. Even many were looking for a way to bring some kind of objectivity and scientific research to the field. And it was not a psychologist who accomplished that goal, it was a Russian physiologist. Physiologist is a person who studies the working of the body. So it was a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov who accidentally stumbled across the basic principles of a particular kind of learning. Now, if we talk more about what is classical conditioning and who first studied it, so studying the digestive system in his dogs, Pavlov had built a device that would accurately measure the amount of saliva produced by the dogs when they were fed a measured amount of food. Now, normally, when food is placed in the mouth of any animal, the salivary glands automatically start releasing saliva to help with chewing and digestion. So this is normal reflex involuntary response in both animals and humans. So the food causes a particular reaction, the salivation. Now, a stimulus can be defined as any object, event, or experience that causes a response, the reaction of an organism. Now, in the case of Pavlov's dog, the food is the stimulus and the salivation is the response. Now let's talk more about the Pavlov and the salivating dogs. So what first annoyed and then intrigued Pavlov was his dogs began salivating when they weren't supposed to be salivating. Now some dogs would start salivating when they saw the lab assistant bringing their food, others when they heard the clatter of the food ball from the kitchen, and still others when it was time of the day they were usually fed. So Pavlov spent the rest of his career studying what he eventually termed classical conditioning, which means learning to make a reflex response to a stimulus other than the original natural stimulus that normally produces it. So this was all about the Pavlov and his salivating dog. We will be learning more about it, but before moving towards his experiment, let us discuss some of the elements of the classical conditioning. So there are basically 4 elements of the classical conditioning which needs to be covered: unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and conditioned response. So Pavlov eventually identified several key elements that must be present and experienced in a particular way for conditioning to take place. So we will be discussing these elements one by one in this video. Let's start with the unconditioned stimulus. Now, the original naturally occurring stimulus mentioned in the preceding slides, you can see, you have already heard. So the original naturally occurring stimulus is called the unconditioned stimulus, and the term unconditioned means unlearned or naturally occurring. So this is the stimulus that ordinarily leads to the reflex involuntary response. Now, in the case of Pavlov's dog, the food served is the unconditioned stimulus. Now, if we talk about the unconditioned response, the reflex response to the unconditioned stimulus is called unconditioned response. So, for much the same reaction, and it is unlearned and occurs because of genetic wiring in the nervous system. Now, for example, in Pavlov's experiment, the food given to the dog is the unconditioned stimulus, and the salivation to that food is the unconditioned response. Now, the next element is conditioned stimulus. Before moving towards the conditioned stimulus, I would like to start it with definitions. So, the definition of the conditioned stimulus is stimulus that becomes able to produce a learned reflex response by being paired with the original unconditioned stimulus. And if you talk about the neutral stimulus, so neutral stimulus is stimulus that has no effect on the desired response. Now, Pavlov determined that almost any kind of stimulus could become associated with the unconditioned stimulus if it is paired with the unconditioned stimulus often enough. So, in his original study, for example, the sight of the food dish itself became a stimulus for salivation before the food was given to the dogs. Every time they got food to which they naturally salivated, they saw the dish. And at this point, the dish was a neutral stimulus because it has no effect on salivation. But after being paired with the food so many times, the dish came to produce the same salivation response, although a somewhat weaker one, as did the food itself. When previously neutral stimulus, through repeated pairing with the unconditioned stimulus, began to cause the same kind of reflexive response, and learning has occurred. Now, the neutral stimulus can now be called a conditioned stimulus. Now, unconditioned means unlearned, and conditioned means learned. So, now let's come to the conditioned response. The conditioned response is the response that is given to the conditioned stimulus is not usually as quite as the original, not usually quite as strong as the original unconditioned response, but it is essentially the same response. However, because it comes as a response to the conditioned stimulus, it is called the conditioned response or sometimes the conditioned reflex. Now, putting it all together, Pavlov's canine, classic, or ding dong bell, what was Pavlov's classic experiment in conditioning? Now, the whole idea of classical conditioning is not as complex as it sounds. What gets tough is keeping all the letters straight. The unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response. So you have to keep all the letters straight. Now, Pavlov did a classic experiment in which he paired the ringing of the bell with the presentation of food to see if dogs would eventually salivate to the sound of the bell. Now, since the bell did not normally produce salivation, it was the neutral stimulus before any conditioning took place. So, the repeated pairing of the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus is usually called acquisition because the organism in this process or because the organism is in the process of acquiring learning. Now, here you can see a chart of how each element of the conditioning relationship worked in the Pavlov experiment. You can notice that the responses, the conditioned response and the unconditioned response, are the same: salivation. And they simply differ in what they are responding to. Now, an unconditioned stimulus is always followed by unconditioned response, and a conditioned stimulus is always followed by a conditioned response. So you must keep this in mind. So, if we talk about the classical conditioning uh, in more detail, so before conditioning takes place, the sound of the bell does not cause salivation and is a neutral stimulus, or an S. So during conditioning, the sound of the bell occurs just because or just before the presentation of food, which is the unconditioned stimulus. Now, the food causes salivation, which is the unconditioned response. And when conditioning has occurred, after several pairing of the bell with the food, the bell will begin to elicit a salivation or salivation response from the dog without any food. So this is learning, and the sound of the bell is now a classical, or is now a conditioned stimulus, and salivation to the bell is the conditioned response. So the bell is now conditioned stimulus, and salivation is now a conditioned response. Now, is this some kind of a rocket science? No, not really. Classical conditioning is actually one of the simplest forms of learning. It is so simple that it happens to people all the time without their even being aware of it. So, if I ask a question, does your mouth water when you merely see an advertisement of your favorite food on television? Or does your stomach get upset every time you hear the high pitched whine of the dentist drill? So, these are both examples of the classical conditioning. After all the dog stories, the salivation to the TV ads probably needs no explanation. But what about the dentist drill? Over the course of many visits to the body comes to associate the sound with the anxiety or fear the person has felt while receiving a painful dental treatment. And so the sound produces a feeling of anxiety. So the body comes to associate that sound, which is the conditioned stimulus, with the anxiety or fear, which is the unconditioned response. So the person which the person has felt while receiving a painful dental treatment, which is again the unconditioned stimulus, and so the sound produces a feeling of anxiety, which is the conditioned response, whether that person is in the chair or just in the outer waiting area. You can also share some other related examples of the classical conditioning with us in the comment section, and it will also help other viewers in clearing their concepts. So, this was all about the examples of the classical conditioning. Although classical conditioning happens quite easily, there are a few basic principles that researchers have discovered. So, there are some of the few basic principles which I would like to share with you. The first one is the first one about the classical conditioning. The first principle: the conditioned stimulus must come before the unconditioned stimulus. Now, if Pavlov rang the bell just after he gave the dogs the food, they did not become conditioned. Number two, the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus must come very close together in time, ideally only several seconds apart. Now, when Pavlov tried to stretch the time between the potential conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus to several minutes, no association was made, and too much could happen in the longer interval of time to interfere with the conditioning. And number 3 is the neutral stimulus must be paired with unconditioned stimulus several times, often many times, before conditioning can take place. And the fourth basic principle of the classical conditioning is the conditioned stimulus is usually some stimulus that is distinctive or stands out from other competing stimulus or other competing stimuli. Now, in Pavlov experiment, the bell was a sound that was not normally present in the laboratory and therefore it was distinct. So this was all about today's video. If your concept is clear, you can like the video. If there was any point that was a bit confusing, you did not get it, you can ask us in the comment section and we will be happy to help you out. Plus, if you are new to this channel, you can subscribe to our channel, click on the bell icon so you will never ever miss any notification. You can also share the link of this video, the link of our channel with your family members and friends because sharing is caring. Until then, Allah Hafiz.